to American economist and the co-founder of the Senior at the Center of Economic and Policy Research, Mr. Dean Baker. Thanks for your time. We were just, getting the latest results. Trump taking Florida, for example, also Texas, which we expected to be perhaps more in question this time round. But looking at the money side of things, Trump, the businessman, he didn't exactly focus on the finance in those final rallies. I imagine, at least in part, this is down to the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and something he got largely criticised for.
Yeah, well, he largely ran on who he was, and that was, to put it crudely, racist, nationalist. And he did say, I mean, he could point to this. Prior to the pandemic, the economy was doing good. And, how much credit he should get for that? It's a very good question. Basically, it was continuing the growth we had seen in the Obama-Biden administration. But people go, where are we? And the fact was the economy continued to grow. The unemployment rate fell. So a lot of people had been doing pretty well prior to the pandemic. So he could point to that. And then he treated the pandemic, he'd refer to it as the plague. He'd throw in a little racism there. He'd call it the China plague and take no responsibility, quite literally. He said, I don't take any responsibility. He was asked once at a press conference, I take no responsibility. So he treated we have over 240,000 deaths now. He just treated this like, oh, he had nothing to do with that, nothing you could do. When, of course, we know there was a lot you could do, and many countries have dealt with it much, much better than the United States. But it became kind of a thing that, okay, Biden thinks we should wear masks. Biden thinks we should social distance. I think we should get everyone together in big rallies and all yell, for Donald Trump. So that really became front and center.
Indeed, when you look at Trump's campaign for this election, he once again promised millions of more jobs, 10 million, in fact, within 10 months if re-elected. He once again said that when it came to taxes, he would be reducing them for big businesses. I mean, that, I imagine, gained a lot of support with major CEOs across the country. But overall, how do you think his first 4 years in office left things financially for people in the more rural areas?
Well, it was a mixed bag. I mean, his trade wars certainly were not helpful, but on the other hand, he did have really massive bailouts, and it was striking. I'll confess, I actually didn't realize the president's power here because there's residual authority for him essentially to give subsidies to farmers without congressional approval. So a lot of farmers actually did pretty well in spite of the trade war. They weren't necessarily doing great. But Trump could say, oh, I was taking care of you. And to a large extent, he was. So rural areas, I'm not going to say they're doing great, but they're doing OK. Part of the story also, we have a big issue here in the United States, fracking. We've had an explosion of fracking in large parts of the country, certainly in Pennsylvania, which is big right now, obviously. And he would take credit for that. Now, for better or worse, that was also the Obama-Biden administration's policy. They were also very supportive of fracking. So that wasn't really qualitative change. The big difference is that Biden, and give Obama some credit here, they did want to have some regulation of that, whereas Trump basically has said, do whatever you want.
Indeed, Joe Biden going into this campaign speaking a bit about that Green Deal, indeed promising trillions of dollars to move towards cleaner energy, also saying he'd like to raise corporate taxes to between 20 and 28%, and the minimum wage bringing it up to $15 an hour. How different do you think the American economy would be under Joe Biden?
I think it'd be a qualitative difference. I mean, Trump benefited enormously from the fact that he had a pretty healthy economy. So it's sort of like, well, I'm going to give a baseball analogy, probably a bad analogy for France, but take a soccer game. You replace the goalie and you're ahead 5-0 in the last 5 minutes, and then your replacement goalie only lets in one goal and then takes credit for the victory. That's sort of the story here. So he benefited from that, but in terms of staging a recovery from the pandemic, I don't think he has any clue what he's doing. He's sort of throwing policies out there, and the reality is most of the serious economists who he had, or I should say people familiar with economic policy, I'm not going to care whether they're economists or not, they've left his administration. So he has people who are basically PR people who are going to be deciding policy, and where that goes, I don't know. Whereas Biden, has pretty specific plans for having an aggressive policy, Green New Deal, whether you call it that or not, promoting clean energy, promoting childcare, ramping up public support for healthcare, which would both meet real needs for large segments of the population and also provide us a very clear path for recovery. So I think we would be talking about a very different scenario in a Biden administration than in a Trump administration.
Indeed, healthcare, one of the main issues they differ on as well. But you mentioned there a little bit earlier, Mr. Baker, that China-US trade relations, hearing again from Donald Trump that, he's going to establish 1 million domestic jobs that were previously based in China if re-elected. During the last 4 years, we have seen a pretty significant, at least on a surface level, trade war between those two nations. How do you see that going forward?
Well, it will matter hugely whether Trump ends up back in the White House or whether Vice President Biden ends up pulling this out. We aren't going to be back where we were before President Trump took office. We've changed our relations with China. But the question is whether we could have sort of a rational path going forward. I mean, Trump basically, someone made the comment, I forget where I'm stealing this from, that he governs by temper tantrum. And, China's a major power. In many ways, it's the equal or even larger economy than the U.S., and we can't push them around. So what we have to figure out, if you want to have serious relations with China, is what are the key issues that we should be upset about? We'll have to make concessions. We can't just hand China a laundry list and say, hey, we want you to do A, B, C, D, and E. They'll throw it in the garbage can. So you have to have a clear idea of what you're trying to do. And I've seen absolutely zero evidence of what Trump is trying to do except pick a fight. And if you do that, the United States obviously is a huge power. We could pick a fight with small countries, with Mexico. We could push them around, largely get our way. We can't do that with China. And anyhow, so I'm not going to say I know exactly what Vice President Biden would do as president, but I think he would at least have a clear strategy. I may not agree with it, but if you don't have a clear strategy when you look to confront China, you're probably not going to get very far.
Overall, Mr. Baker, how do you see the US at an international standing since Donald Trump took office?
Well, obviously, the U.S. standing has plunged, and that's been kind of by choice. I mean, Trump quite clearly has contempt for international institutions. Currently, obviously, the big one, WHO, he's pulling us out of the World Health Organization. We haven't cooperated at all in trying to develop a vaccine, something which actually might backfire for us because it looks like China is ahead of us in developing a vaccine, and it would have been fantastic, well, both for the world and for people here, if we had collaborated with them. So we would have earlier access to it, but so would other countries as well if we were doing this jointly. But he has open contempt. So I'm not trying to read anything into what he says. He has open contempt for international institutions. And obviously, other countries recognize that, and they realize, okay, the United States is not a serious player internationally. They're going to do whatever Donald Trump feels like. So, yeah, our standing has fallen enormously, and it's a very, very different world. I'm not always happy with what prior presidents had done with NATO, with our international alliances, but to my view, it was at least valuable that they did try to cooperate with other nations rather than basically give them a middle finger and just say, we don't care what you think, we're going to do what we want.
Mr. Dean Baker, Senior Economist at the Centre for Economic and Policy Research, coming to us live from Washington. Thanks indeed for your time.